Showers for North Wales, northwest England, and particularly western Scotland, where they're falling as snow over the hills. A scattering of showers coming in on a brisk breeze for Northern Ireland. It is breezy, but it's pretty mild across the south, 11, 12 degrees. Further north, closer to average in single figures. We'll keep the showers coming in across Scotland this evening. Still some snow over the hills. Mostly rain at lower levels. The showers elsewhere easing off, so much of England and Wales having a dry night and a clear night, and a bit of a cold one as well. Enough breeze to stop towns and cities dropping to freezing, but certainly rural areas, some pockets of frost possible. We start off with more wet weather then across Scotland, and this weather front is going to be slower to head southwards, so quite a wet day over the Highlands, the rain turning increasingly to snow, but also pushing into the central belt and Northern Ireland, so a soggy afternoon here. For England and Wales, most places dry, just a few showers drifting into South Wales, the Midlands and southwest England. Sunny spells across the east, but it's going to get windy, particularly to the east of the Pennines, northeast England up to eastern Scotland. Very gusty conditions through Wednesday afternoon, and increasingly the winds picking up and bringing more snow showers through Wednesday night across western Scotland and Northern Ireland. So we're quite concerned about this area here, that cold front pushing south, introducing the cold air everywhere, but some snow and strong winds likely in the northwest as we go into Thursday. That's all your weather from me for now. Goodbye.
I'm Darren McCaffrey, and join me on The Briefing Monday to Thursday at 3 p.m. You'll get your afternoon fix of all the latest political stories, debate and analysis, as well as interviews with some of the biggest names in UK politics.
It's a problem that affects the whole world, Darren.
From Westminster to Cardiff, Edinburgh and Belfast, if it's happening in UK politics, we've got it covered. That's The Briefing with me, Darren McCaffrey, Monday to Thursday, 3 p.m. on GB News.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon.
And Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
On GB News with me, Alex Phillips, where we get stuck into the big issues of the day that need looking at in depth. Nothing is off the table and nobody will be cancelled for saying what they think. Keeping me company today is political commentator Benedict Spence. Here's what we've got coming up on the show. As Russian tanks breach the borders of Ukraine, Boris Johnson announces a barrage of sanctions. Is this the beginning of war in Europe? We cross live to a journalist in Ukraine for the latest on the knife-edge crisis. Plus, First Minister Nicola Sturgeon is to announce an update to Scotland's coronavirus strategy. We'll see what she has to say in Holyrood. And did COVID start from a lab leak. Well, 2 years of calling scientists who stated that the virus was man-made conspiracy theorists, opinion is beginning to turn. I'll be speaking to the author of a seminal text on the origins of the pandemic. That's what we're talking about for the next hour. But what do you need to talk about? Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet us at gbnews. But first, it's time for the GB News headlines with Rosie. Good afternoon to you. It's 1 minute past 2. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News. The Prime Minister has announced sanctions against 5 Russian banks and 3 very high net wealth individuals. It's the first in what Boris Johnson says will be a barrage of measures against the Kremlin, as he warns Vladimir Putin appears set on overrunning Ukraine. The Prime Minister told MPs that Russia's deployment of troops into parts of eastern Ukraine, which Russia has now recognised as independent states, amounts to a renewed invasion of the country. Boris Johnson urged the British people to brace themselves for the next stages of President Putin's plan.
We cannot tell what will happen in the days ahead, but, Mr. Speaker, we should steel ourselves for a protracted crisis. The United Kingdom will meet this challenge side by side with our allies, determined that we will not allow Putin to drag our continent back into a Hobbesian state of nature where aggression pays and might is right. And it is precisely because the stakes are so high that Putin's venture in Ukraine must fail.
Earlier, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky says the country may break ties with Russia.
I would like to tell you that I've received a request from the Foreign Ministry. I will consider the issue of severing diplomatic relations between Ukraine and the Russian Federation. Immediately after our press conference, I will consider this issue as well as other issues like our steps regarding escalation by the Russian Federation.
Of course, this is a developing story and we'll keep you up to date here on GB News. In other developments today, now Scotland's First Minister is going to outline her plan for dealing with coronavirus in the next hour. Nicola Sturgeon's going to speak to MSPs as the Scottish Government's blueprint for managing and recovering from COVID-19 is published. Early this month, she'd said Scotland was through the worst of the Omicron wave of coronavirus and the situation was much more positive than at the start of the year. Well, Scottish Conservative Shadow Health and Social Care Secretary Dr Sandesh Gillane is fully supportive of Boris Johnson's strategy.
Restrictions have to end at some point. We've got to stop what we're doing at some point. It's easy to criticise. It's very easy to criticise. Labour are criticising, the SNP are criticising. But what they need to do is have an alternative plan. There's no point saying this is rubbish. What they need to do is say this is what we would do instead and these are the reasons why.
The Queen has cancelled some planned virtual arrangements today as she's still suffering from cold-like symptoms because of coronavirus. Well, that's according to a statement from Buckingham Palace. They say Her Majesty is experiencing mild symptoms and will continue with light duties. It's understood that any of Her Majesty's plans over the coming week will be decided nearer the time. Health leaders, charities and unions have raised concerns over Boris Johnson's Living with COVID plan that was unveiled yesterday. The Prime Minister announced free universal testing for the general public for COVID would be scrapped in April, but it's not been confirmed if that includes frontline healthcare workers. The NHS Confederation say 94% of health leaders say staff shouldn't be paying for tests. A charity's warning most women don't know the key symptoms of ovarian cancer. A poll for Target Ovarian Cancer found the majority of women didn't recognise bloating, abdominal pain and feeling full as warning signs. It also found GPs were too quick to dismiss symptoms. Well, Deputy Chief Executive of the charity, Alex Holden, is calling on the government for more education.
The symptoms are fairly clear, even in early stages of ovarian cancer. The vast majority of people will experience those symptoms as well. So it would be just to consider it early. So we ask GPs to be thinking about it earlier and also women to be raising it earlier as well. If women were going to GPs and saying, actually, have you thought about ovarian cancer? That would also help.
The fossil of a flying dinosaur known as a pterosaur has been found on the Isle of Skye. The discovery's excited scientists. Experts estimate they lived roughly 170 million years ago, soaring over what then would have been lagoons in a subtropical landscape. It's believed they caught fish and squid with crisscrossing teeth, apparently perfect for snaring slippery prey. You're now up to date on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's head over to Alex for We Need to Talk About.
When is an invasion not an invasion? When it's spun as a peacekeeping mission. And so, Russian tanks have rolled into Ukraine under the guise of supporting the independence of the East. The blue touch paper has been lit. Are you surprised? I'm not. Commentators who dismissed Putin's tooling up as just power projection, showboating European leaders that tried to appease the Kremlin's demands, successive governments that allowed oligarchs to hide ill-gotten gains, greedy banks hungry for Russian trade, the boneheaded Western religion of climate change handcuffing a continent to a dictator's gas pipeline, the utter nonsense of blaming Brexit on Russia when Putin's advisors told him it would unleash the transatlantic alliance from EU compromise. The mismanagement and myopia of European geopolitics for over 2 decades have emboldened a zealot who has demonstrated repeatedly that he cannot be trusted. And so, Germany has finally halted Nord Stream 2, but now at the cost of an energy crisis. Sanctions meant to spook Putin are instead spooking European banks. And a convoy of EU leaders have spent the last 2 months telling Putin they won't put boots on the ground if he invades. So, as the war games begin, is the European response too little, too late? Only time will tell, and there's not much of it left. Joining me now on the show is journalist Milcha Babu, who is currently in eastern Ukraine, and Associate Fellow at Chatham House, Samantha de Benden. Milcha, let's start with you. What is the situation like there? I'm sure that tensions are significantly ramped up.
Hi, I'm in the city center of Mariupol right now, actually in one of the biggest shopping malls in the area. And what I can tell you is that there's not much activity going on. There's not much shopping being done, as you can imagine, but at the same time, this particular shopping center does have a significant number of ATMs, and what I've seen throughout the day was people queuing up to withdraw money and then going to the exchange offices to exchange it in currencies they think they will be worth more on the long term, mid and long term. I spoke with a few people here in the shopping mall in Mariupol, which is a city about 500,000 people, right just literally on the border with Russia, very close to the border with Russia. And they were telling me throughout the day that they're very worried that this is a significant change in attitude compared to a week ago, when you will ask people on the streets in Ukraine if they were worried, and they will say, they will brush it off. They will say the war will not come to Ukraine. Well, apparently now it's here, and people are preparing for the worst. They're not even hoping for the best and preparing for the worst. They're just preparing for the worst. In terms of changing money, in terms of queuing up to the petrol stations to fill up their gas, I've seen. I went just outside the petrol station close to this shopping mall in Mariupol, and I've seen the prices change within 5 minutes 3 times, just as I was there just grabbing a coffee, which to me, obviously, it's a sign that things are just rapidly moving and shifting throughout eastern Ukraine. The city is empty. The train that I came into from Kiev was almost deserted, with the exception of a few journalists. And people were just either staying in house or they were leaving the city last night and throughout the day for much safer places outside eastern Ukraine, or some of them outside the country altogether.
Milcha, don't go anywhere. Samantha, I'm going to go to you now. I suppose we're all waiting to see what Putin does next, but I think a lot of that depends on what the reaction from the West is going to be. We are, of course, waiting to see the package of sanctions that the EU has to offer. Do you think there's going to be anything they can do strong enough to make Putin think again?
Sadly, I don't. And I think that at this point, Putin has moved beyond acting in a rational way. Yesterday, he gave a 2-hour televised address to his Security Council, and I watched it from beginning to end. It was like watching a bad James Bond film with a very bad villain. And Putin was basically sitting on his throne, calling the members of his Security Council to come and say what they thought about the breakaway republics, and they were obviously all absolutely terrified. You had the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service quivering in his shoes as he was reciting by rote something that he clearly didn't even believe, and he made a mistake. He stumbled, and Putin reprimanded him like a teacher reprimands a naughty schoolboy, and they said, okay, go and sit down, come up the next one. This is the behavior of somebody who has stopped behaving like a statesman and who seems to have lost all contact with reality. He then went on state television and addressed the Russian population and said that Ukraine does not really have the right to exist as an independent state. This is the most transparency we have seen from Putin to date, who so far has always hid behind some kind of deniability as to his real designs on Ukraine. And there's another very worrying development, which also makes me think that he's already decided to go full on and to invade the rest of the country, irrespective of what sanctions are pronounced against him. In Munich last week, the Ukrainian president made a very veiled threat to remind the world that Ukraine once had nuclear weapons and that Ukraine would potentially have the ability to become a nuclear state very, very fast if it decided to. Many people will disagree as to how fast this could happen. But in 1994, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for a promise from Russia, the United Kingdom, France, and the United States that they would respect and uphold its territorial integrity. What Zelensky said is, you have not upheld your side of the bargain. Why should Ukraine? Very few Western journalists have picked up on this because it was cushioned in language referring to memorandums that most people don't actually understand. The Russians, of course, picked up on this. Putin picked up on this and repeated it more than once during his address to his people and to the Security Council. And Russian analysts I'm speaking to think that he will use this at a later date as a pretext to take out vital infrastructure in Ukraine that he will accuse of being in the process of building some kind of nuclear capability, military nuclear capability. This is very worrying indeed. And I've tried to remain optimistic throughout the last few weeks, last few months. This morning I woke up very pessimistic indeed as to the future of Ukraine, the whole of the country.
Yeah, I mean, coming back to you, Milch, you heard Samantha there, and she is an expert in sort of, Putin's mind games and Russian power projection, saying that from what she's read and what she's seen, the man seems detached from reality, and she now thinks that a full-scale invasion is no longer off the table, that could happen. Is that being reflected in reaction in Ukrainian media?
Well, absolutely. Ukrainian media, although some of it is obviously biased by the fact that some of the journalists are directly affected by what's going on in their own country, and at the same time, the language they use, some of the media here is towards eastern Ukraine, towards the occupied territories, is they call them terrorists, which obviously is different than what we call it in Western media as separatist pro-Russian forces or Putin-backed militias. There's a strong language in Ukraine. There's obviously a lot of emotion going on amongst journalists here, local journalists. But here in Mariupol, just to pinpoint the location that I'm at and the importance of it, it has to do very much with the fact that this is a city that, if you think that we are in a full-fledged war, and I think the same, this city will definitely be the key point in the next few days, because it's a city that has an open to the sea, and it will connect the so-called Donbas republics, the two autonomous republics, to Crimea and to a sea, to allow them to have imports and exports, basically bringing a lifeline to the occupied territories. So if we're going to see some developments here, in my opinion, I think they will happen in Mariupol or in and around the city in eastern Ukraine, in one of the biggest cities in eastern Ukraine.
Yeah, Milcher, thank you so much for being right there at the centre of the action for us and giving us that feedback. Now, Samantha, we are, of course, waiting to see how the EU reacts, to see if they can put together a package that could deter Vladimir Putin from going further. But what do you think Ukraine's response will be if he does continue to act with military aggression in the east of Ukraine? Do you believe that Ukraine has the capability to put up a valiant response?
Well, if you look at the sheer numbers, how many soldiers Ukraine has and how many soldiers Russia has, then the balance looks very much in Russia's favor. But in Ukraine, you will see a mobilization not only of the military, but of the civilian population. You've had reports last week of the so-called babushka brigades, the grandmothers training to learn to shoot. Ukraine has a lot of women who are in the army and who are prepared to fight. And the Russians will encounter resistance in every single town, in every single village. And these are people who are going to be fighting for their lives. The Ukrainian soldiers who were mobilized now are fighting to defend their country. The Russian soldiers who are going in may be superior in number. A lot of them are terrified young men who do not want to go to war and who will be encountering people who hate them. And this is you know, the Soviet Union was not able to win the war in Afghanistan. The United States were not able to win the war in Vietnam. An invading army very rarely wins in the long term. The Russians may take some territory, but will they hold the territory with the fierce resistance they will meet from the Ukrainians? I don't think so. I know analysts I know think so. Invading armies never succeed for a long time. And history has shown that time and time again.
Samantha Milcher, thank you so much for joining me on today's show and giving us the latest in these critical developments. Well, I'm going to turn now to my guest today, Benedict. I mean, we are now waiting to see what the EU are going to do. We know that Boris Johnson is putting sanctions on 5 Russian banks, not the biggest banks, and 3 oligarchs who have squirreled away money in the City of London. But the problem here really, isn't it, that the reaction should have been 8 years ago. And in that period of time, the EU has exposed itself to many liabilities when it comes to sanctions against Russia. Germany today have said they will suspend Nord Stream 2. I mean, it's not really much, is it?
It's nothing in the grand scheme of things, and it's nothing that the Russians weren't prepared for, and as you say, have been preparing for 8 years. The Russian economy is... people like to, you know, they revel in this when they say the Russian economy, it's the size of Spain's, it's tiny, and you kind of go, well, yeah, it is, but also actually what it exports to the rest of the world is vital. Actually, for global infrastructure. We're not just talking about fossil fuels. That's what everybody always goes for. It's also the world's single largest producer of agricultural fertilizer. By some distance, or between 66 and 75%. That's not a very sexy headline. When you think about it, you then think, but let's say they stopped exporting that. Let's say that people put sanctions on that. What happens to food supplies around the world in countries like China and India? All of a sudden, countries in Africa, for example, they start falling like dominoes because they can't feed their populations, because they can't fertilize their own soil. Russia has actually played a very good hand, as you say, in the last sort of 8 years, of making its very small economy very important to the rest of the world. Also in things like rare earth minerals, things like potassium, things like plutonium. These are actually all sorts of things that Russia does produce that we all need. And these are not things that you will see sanctions placed on. And as you say, you know, Germany has said it's going to suspend Nord Stream 2. It's not going to cancel it, it's just going to suspend it. Nord Stream 1, on the other hand, that's just going to keep on pumping gas. And that's fine. And the other thing, of course, people aren't paying attention to is that, let's say, Russia invades Ukraine and it takes it over. Well, then it doesn't need Nord Stream 2, because then it has access to all of Ukraine's gas and oil pipe networks. You know, Putin will have priced all of this in. All of the sanctions that are being taken on oligarchs in London, all of this has been prepared for. It's been war-gamed. He has weighed it up and he's gone, this is an acceptable price to pay to invade into eastern Ukraine. And just on what Samantha was saying there, whether or not Russia can actually invade and hold it, it probably can't invade and hold the whole of the country. But that's not actually what they want to do. What they want to do is invade the eastern part, right up to the Dnieper River, and that will see them take cities like Mariupol, it'll see Donetsk and Luhansk, but also cities like Dnipro and Kharkiv. They will all become parts of Russia. That's the industrial core. He doesn't need the rest of the country. All he then needs to do is basically go to Kiev and say, well, that's that then, and install a pro-Kremlin government, as they have in Belarus. So they don't actually have to take a hold of this, the whole country. They don't need to have troops stationed in the whole thing, but they will effectively control it. That's the end game here. And I've heard that a lot as well, the comparison to Afghanistan. Ukraine is nothing like Afghanistan. Culturally, it is very similar to Russia, whereas Afghanistan was completely diametrically opposed to the West. And geographically, it doesn't have these large mountain ranges that, an insurgency can hide out in. It's flat. And that's the thing. The Russians have massively superior tactical organization on the ground, massively superior air support. The Russians even have hypersonic missiles that even the US doesn't have because they couldn't be bothered to put the expenditure into the research. Ultimately, this is an incredibly grave situation. And I do find it very interesting that people like Zelensky are suggesting that there might be resorting to things like nuclear weapons, which you'd imagine would be quite rudimentary. But some sort of real doomsday scenario is probably all that they have right now to try to terrify the Russian top brass into saying, don't listen to what Putin is saying, because we will fight dirty in order to keep you out.
Benedict, thank you. I really want to know your views on this. What do you think about Europe's reaction to the Ukraine crisis? Is it a case of being too little, too late? Or maybe you think Europe shouldn't even intervene? Has policy making on the European continent been, frankly, tragically myopic for the past 8 years at least, ever since Russia annexed Crimea? Email me, gbviews@gbnews.uk. You can also tweet us at gbnews, so I get an impression what you, the great people of the United Kingdom, really think. You're with GB News on TV and radio. Time for a short break now and a check on the weather forecast.
Hello again. Bright and breezy sums up the afternoon for most of us. Sunny spells. There are a few showers around. It's breezy, but of course nothing like as windy as recent days. We've actually got a fairly active cold front slipping south. Active means it's got some pretty heavy rain on it. Earlier today brought a very wet start over parts of southern Scotland, northern England and Wales, but it is pushing southwards, and as it is drifting southwards, it's fizzling out. Still bringing some rain for a time across East Anglia and the southeast through the early afternoon, but it is scooting away fairly rapidly. Sunshine follows and a few showers for North Wales, northwest England, and particularly western Scotland, where they're falling as snow over the hills. A scattering of showers coming in on a brisk breeze for Northern Ireland. It is breezy, but it's pretty mild across the south, 11, 12 degrees. Further north, closer to average in single figures. We'll keep the showers coming in across Scotland this evening. Still some snow over the hills. Mostly rain at lower levels. The showers elsewhere easing off, so much of England and Wales having a dry night and a clear night and a bit of a cold one as well. Enough breeze to stop towns and cities dropping to freezing, but certainly rural areas, some pockets of frost possible. We start off with more wet weather then across Scotland, and this weather front is going to be slower to head southwards, so quite a wet day over the Highlands, the rain turning increasingly to snow, but also pushing into the central belt and Northern Ireland, so a soggy afternoon here. For England and Wales, most places dry, just a few showers drifting into South Wales, the Midlands and southwest England. Sunny spells across the east, but it's going to get windy, particularly to the east of the Pennines, northeast England up to eastern Scotland. Very gusty conditions through Wednesday afternoon, and increasingly the winds picking up and bringing more snow showers through Wednesday night across western Scotland and Northern Ireland. So we're quite concerned about this area here, that cold front pushing south, introducing the cold air everywhere, but some snow and strong winds likely in the northwest as we go into Thursday. That's all your weather from me for now. Goodbye.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. We are waiting for the latest announcement from Hollywood as Nicola Sturgeon will lay out Scotland's plan for COVID. Well, she's just stood up now, so we're going to go straight to Edinburgh to hear those latest announcements.
On vaccines, treatments and sensible public health behaviours and adaptations. However, much as we might wish it was not the case, COVID is still a public health risk here and globally, and likely to remain so for the foreseeable future. So we must also remain vigilant and prepared. To that end, I will also outline how we will categorise and respond to future risks, including from new variants. And I will explain why our decisions must be based on a combination of data, evidence and judgment. Thirdly, I will give our assessment of the current situation in Scotland in light of recent data and set out an indicative timescale for lifting or converting to guidance the small number of legally binding measures that still remain in place. And finally, I will set out our commitment to continued access to PCR and lateral flow testing free of charge, while we transition to a system of testing that is more targeted but which retains adequate capacity to support surveillance, rapid response to the emergence of new variants, effective outbreak management and access to the best care and treatment for those who need it. And I'll also confirm our advice that those testing positive for COVID should continue to self-isolate for now. On the issue of testing, Presiding Officer, I must express frustration at the UK Government's position. It is, of course, for the Prime Minister to decide how best to tackle COVID in England. However, current funding arrangements mean that while taxpayers in all 4 UK nations contribute to the costs, it is decisions taken for England that determine the resources available to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland for testing and other COVID measures. As of now, we have no clarity on how much of the COVID testing infrastructure the UK Government intends to retain, no clarity on how much investment will support it in future, and no clarity on whether the Treasury will provide additional resources or demand instead that funding is taken from elsewhere in the health budget. I hope we do get this clarity soon so that we can then set out in more detail our own longer-term approach to testing. However, and I'll say more on this later, I want to give an assurance now that the Scottish Government is determined to retain a robust testing system capable of providing Scotland with strong resilience against future COVID threats and firmly aligned with public health advice and the principles underpinning our National Health Service. Let me turn now to the key points in detail, starting with our revised strategic approach. In earlier phases of the pandemic, it was important to try to eliminate COVID or suppress it to the lowest possible level, because then we did not have vaccines or treatments to protect against the serious illness and death that the virus can cause. That is why our objective initially was to suppress the virus to the lowest possible level, though we modified that somewhat last year. In today's update, it is modified further and now expressed as follows: to manage COVID effectively, primarily through adaptations and health measures that strengthen our resilience and recovery as we rebuild for a better future. This change is possible because widespread vaccination coverage and better treatments have reduced the direct harms of the virus. As a result, using restrictions to suppress infection is no longer as necessary as it once was, and given the wider harms caused by protective measures, it is no longer as justifiable either. The strategic framework, therefore, makes clear that in future we will seek to rely much less on legally imposed measures and more on vaccines, treatments and sensible adaptations and good public health behaviours. As a priority, we will continue to ensure the maximum possible availability and uptake of vaccination in line with expert advice. While the success of the vaccination programme has exceeded our expectations, there are today still more than 600,000 people over 18 who have had a second dose but not yet a third or booster dose. So there is more still to do to maximise uptake. We will also continue to extend the scope of vaccination. Last week, the JCVI recommended that all 5 to 11-year-olds, not just those at highest clinical risk, should be eligible for the vaccine. And I can confirm today that vaccine appointments for this age group will issue from mid-March. To allow parents and carers to attend with children, most appointments will be in the evenings, at weekends or during the Easter school holidays. Yesterday, we also accepted JCVI advice on protecting those at highest risk. It is now our intention to offer care home residents, those over 75 and anyone over 12 who is immunosuppressed, an additional booster 6 months after their last JAG. This phase of the programme will also start in March, though the scheduling of appointments for individuals will depend on the timing of their initial booster or third dose. In addition to vaccination, we will also use the best available treatments for those who need them. There are already effective treatments available which reduce serious illness and death in those who have been admitted to hospital with COVID. Therapeutic medicines are also now being offered to patients who have not been hospitalised but who are assessed as being at greatest risk of needing hospital treatment. And new oral antiviral treatments are currently being evaluated through a UK-wide study. We will make the best use of those treatments depending on what the evidence and expert advice tells us about their efficacy. Vaccination and treatment will play a major, perhaps the major role in limiting the health harm caused by this virus in the months and indeed the years to come. However, it is also important to encourage and support people to adopt safe practices and to make basic adaptations that will help keep us safe. The document we are publishing today gives more detail on the kinds of behaviours and adaptations that will be encouraged in different circumstances. These include enhanced hygiene across the general population and improved ventilation in workplaces and other settings, and especially when levels of infection may be higher, increased hybrid and flexible working and the use of face coverings in some indoor public places. It is less likely that any of these measures will be legally imposed in future, but we will advise them for as long as they help keep the virus under control and also help protect those who are most vulnerable to it. It is also vital, of course, that we remain vigilant for new developments. It is, unfortunately, highly likely that this virus will continue to mutate and confront us with new and potentially more harmful variants in future. To identify and respond to such threats quickly, we will maintain a strong surveillance capability. We will set this out in more detail next month, but subject to the point I made earlier about the overall resources available to us, our surveillance system will include extensive PCR sampling and processing capacity, wastewater sampling and genomic sequencing capability. We also welcome confirmation that the UK-wide COVID infection survey conducted by the Office for National Statistics will continue. It is essential, however, that it continues at scale, and we will seek to work with the UK Government to ensure that this is the case. Presiding Officer, this surveillance capacity will help us identify new threats rapidly. It will also help us assess the potential severity of any new threat and quickly determine the appropriate level of response. The strategic update we are publishing today sets out a clear framework for any decisions we may have to take in future in response to new developments. I want to stress this is intended as a contingency. We do hope, of course, that we never have to use it. However, it does recognise the ongoing challenge that COVID presents and sets out 3 broad levels of future potential threat: low, medium and high. It also offers illustrative examples of the type of protective measures that could be deployed in response to different threat levels, and it may be helpful to illustrate this through some general examples. If a new variant emerged that was more transmissible and more severe, perhaps with the ability to evade vaccine or natural immunity, this threat would likely be classified as high. In those circumstances, we might advise people to limit social contacts for a period and to work from home where possible, and we may introduce some temporary protections for high-risk settings. If a new variant, though, was either more transmissible or more severe, but not both, as is the case with Omicron, the initial threat assessment would likely be medium. In these circumstances, there may be a legal requirement to wear face coverings in some settings, and we might issue guidance for businesses and service providers on reasonable measures to reduce the spread of COVID on their premises. Lastly, in the absence of a new variant, or if a new variant was neither more transmissible nor more severe, and if vaccines continue to be effective, the threat classification would likely remain low. Obviously, this is the level we hope to reach and stay at on a sustainable basis. In these circumstances, there would be no legally imposed protective measures. Instead, we would continue to advise individuals and organisations to adopt sensible public health behaviours. It is important to stress that any decision about the threat level and what the appropriate response should be will be guided by data and evidence, but it is not an exact science. It will also, by necessity, involve judgment. That is because the kind of developments we may face in future, principally new variants, will not be uniform in their potential impact. A new variant that is highly transmissible but less severe would obviously require a different response to one that was less transmissible but more severe. So we must guard against a one-size-fits-all approach. That's why the framework doesn't propose fixed thresholds for action, for example, by stating that we will take certain predetermined steps if the number of cases rises above a specific level. Such thresholds may be superficially attractive because of the certainty they appear to provide, but they pose a very significant risk of both under- and overreaction. Now, the framework I have just described can be used to categorise our current threat level and therefore help guide decisions in the coming period, and I'll return to that shortly. But first, let me summarise the latest data and trends. Today, we are reporting 6,427 new cases from lateral flow and PCR tests. 1,060 people are in hospital, 9 more than yesterday. 25 people are in intensive care, the same as yesterday. And sadly, in the past 24 hours, 18 further deaths have been registered of people with COVID under the daily definition. And again, my condolences go to everyone mourning a loved one. Over the past week, reported cases have fallen very slightly by around 1%. They've fallen in all age groups under 45 and risen in all age groups over 45. The latest available data shows that hospital admissions have slightly increased again from 619 in the week to 11th February to 654 in the most recent week. And total hospital occupancy has also increased again, and we will obviously continue to keep a close watch on this. The number of people in intensive care with COVID-25 continues to be relatively low. So in summary, we continue to face a very highly transmissible variant that is causing a high level of community infection. However, while it is far from harmless, its overall impact is less severe than Delta. So using the framework I described earlier, we assess the current threat level to be medium. However, assuming the level of infection and its associated impacts, for example, hospital admissions, falls or broadly stabilises, we would expect this to be reassessed as low in the period ahead. This has enabled Cabinet to agree this morning an indicative timescale for lifting or converting to guidance the small number of legally imposed protective measures that remain in place at this stage. So I can confirm, firstly, that the COVID certification scheme requiring certain venues and events to check the vaccine or test status of attendees will come to an end next Monday, the 28th of February. The app which supports the scheme will remain operational, however, so any business that wishes to continue COVID certification on a voluntary basis to reassure customers will be able to do so. Second, as of 21st March, assuming no significant adverse developments in the course of the virus, we expect that the legal requirement to wear face coverings in certain indoor settings and on public transport will be converted to guidance. We will continue to strongly recommend the wearing of face coverings in shops and other indoor public places and on public transport. We also expect on 21st March to lift the legal requirement for businesses, places of worship and service providers to have regard to guidance on COVID and to take practicable measures set out in the guidance. And the legal requirement on businesses and service providers to retain customer contact details is also expected to end on 21st March. Presiding officers, governments obviously must act lawfully, and that means we cannot impose legal restrictions when it is disproportionate to do so. As the situation improves and the severity of the impact from COVID reduces, we are therefore duty-bound to remove legally imposed restrictions. But this should not be taken as a signal that COVID no longer presents any risk to health, because it clearly does. So even though certain measures, for example face coverings, may not be legal requirements in future, we will still recommend voluntary compliance as part of the range of behaviours that will help keep us safe as we manage COVID in a more sustainable and less restrictive way. Presiding officer, let me turn now finally to testing. Testing has been, and it will continue to be, a vital part of our management of COVID. However, as the nature of the threat and our approach to managing it evolves, so too will our approach to testing. It is reasonable, over time and barring adverse developments, to move away from mass population-wide asymptomatic testing towards a more targeted system focused on specific priorities. These priorities will include surveillance, rapid detection of and response to new variants, effective outbreak management, particularly in high-risk settings like care homes and hospitals, and ensuring access to care and treatment for those who need it. However, it is vital that we make this transition in a careful and a phased manner. So in March, by which time I hope we will have more clarity from the UK Government on available resources, we will publish a detailed transition plan for Test and Protect, setting out our priorities in more detail and describing the scale of infrastructure that will remain in place for the longer term. The plan will also confirm the duration beyond the end of March of any transition period during which the system will operate broadly on the same basis as now. The public health reasons for ensuring a careful phased transition from the current arrangements to a more targeted testing system are obviously the most important. But we should also remember that hundreds of people in Test and Protect, at testing sites across the country and in our processing labs, including Glasgow Lighthouse, have worked tirelessly to keep us safe over these past 2 years. And these decisions affect their jobs and livelihoods, a point seemingly overlooked by the UK Government yesterday. So let me record our thanks to them today and give an assurance that the Scottish Government will engage closely with them in the weeks ahead. Presiding officer, as we do this work in the coming weeks and for the transition period, subject to one change I will set out shortly, access to testing will continue on broadly the same basis as now. We will be considering separately advice for schools and health and care workers in line with expert advice. But for the general public, let me set out clearly what this means from now until further notice. Firstly, if you have COVID symptoms, you should continue to go for a PCR test. Access to these tests will remain free of charge at testing sites across the country. Second, you should continue to make regular use of lateral flow tests, even if you don't have symptoms. The only immediate change we are making to current arrangements on lateral flow tests for the general population is in our advice on the frequency of testing. Instead of advice to test before going anywhere to mix with others, we will, from Monday next week, revert to advice to test at least twice a week, and in particular if you're going to a crowded place or mixing with someone who is clinically vulnerable. Lateral flow tests will remain free of charge in the transition phase. Indeed, we consider it important, in line with the principle of healthcare free at the point of use, that they should remain free of charge for any circumstance in which government recommends testing, and this is a principle we will seek to uphold in our longer-term plan for testing. Presiding officer, I also want to emphasise that in Scotland for now, we will continue to ask those who test positive for COVID to isolate for the recommended period, and we will continue to make self-isolation support payments available to those who are eligible. We will, of course, keep the recommended period of isolation under review, but I think it is worth stressing that isolating, staying at home when positive with a highly infectious virus and the follow-up tracing that Test and Protect does remains one of the most fundamental public health protections that we have available to us. It helps limit transmission overall, and in helping keep workplaces and other settings safer, it also provides protection for those most at risk of serious illness from COVID, enabling them to return to more normal lives as well. Presiding Officer, COVID is unfortunately still with us, and we must therefore remain vigilant and prepared for the threats it poses. But today's new framework is an important moment in our recovery. It marks the point at which we move away, hopefully sustainably, from legal restrictions and rely instead on sensible...
First Minister Nicola Sturgeon there addressing MSPs in Holyrood about the change to Scotland's COVID restrictions. She says that COVID is still a big public health risk. The vaccine passport scheme is set to come to an end. Face coverings will not be legally mandated, but there'll be strong guidelines still recommending them, particularly in indoor spaces. There'll be hybrid working recommendations, again not legally mandated. Free testing will remain at COVID testing sites, and also lateral flow tests will remain free of charge. But the advice on the frequency of testing will change, and that is to test twice a week or when going to a crowded place or to see a vulnerable person. Scotland outlining its changes to COVID restrictions. Now, moving on. A little reported addition to the Prime Minister's repeal of COVID restrictions yesterday in England was the message that the UK would be stepping up biosecurity to prevent lab leaks that could trigger a fresh pandemic. 2 years of gobbling up Chinese propaganda and labelling people who believed COVID to be man-made as conspiracy theorists, with perhaps most disgustingly even the WHO dancing to Beijing's tune. The tide is now turning, with growing consensus among eminent scientists that the virus could not have evolved zoonotically from a bat and a pangolin in a wet market. Lord Matt Ridley, who has sold over 1 million books and is a member of the Academy of Medical Sciences, has penned a seminal text with molecular biologist and cell engineering expert Alina Chan, looking in depth and under the microscope at COVID-19 to draw the conclusion that the pandemic stems from gain-of-function experiments in a laboratory in Wuhan. Well, I'm thrilled to say he joins me now. Lord Ridley, it really is an honour and a privilege to have you here. I mean, first of all, let's start with, before we get on to the details of the origins of COVID-19, how has it been over the last 2 years being basically called a conspiracist and a lunatic?
Well, to be fair, we don't say we think it definitely came from a lab. We say that's a strong possibility, and it looks more likely than that it came through the market. So we're still open to any possibility. But even saying that much has had us cancelled and hugely criticised for raising the possibility. And it's not just from Chinese direction, although, of course, the Chinese authorities have been extremely critical of us. They've done some rather amusing things, like inventing a Swiss scientist who was critical of the lab leak theory. The Swiss embassy eventually said, hang on, this chap doesn't exist, and he disappeared again shortly afterwards. But apart from that, we've had many Western virologists saying, oh, look, please don't talk about this, and how dare you say it might have been a lab leak. Of course, we're open to both possibilities too. Well, that's all we're saying, is let's have a credible investigation. We know that it's a strong possibility that this began in an experiment in a laboratory. Let's investigate.
How difficult has it been to investigate, though, with redacted paperwork, things going missing, this sort of veil of silence that have been placed over the research community, and even daring to assert that it could be a man-made virus?
Well, it has been extraordinary because, you know, the normal sources you would rely on, you'd ring up scientists in China and say, what experiments were you doing, et cetera, et cetera. Got no response from any of that. We've sent, questions to scientists, even in the West. You know, Peter Daszak was a close collaborator, an American-based scientist with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, has refused to answer any of my questions, or those of my co-author. So we've been, and frankly, the scientific establishment's been pretty useless. They've been saying that they don't know how it started, and they're not going to investigate, essentially. And I said to the Royal Society, shouldn't you be having debates about this? And they said, no, we only debate scientific matters. Well, this is a scientific matter. So we've had to rely, therefore, because much of the mainstream media has not been much, with some honourable exceptions, have not been looking into this. So we've had to rely on some surprising sources. There's one or two rather brilliant open source analysts. These are people who just, they're not doing anything secret or illegal. They're just getting hold of logins that enable them to look at Chinese websites, digging out theses, digging out entries in genome databases, digging out reports of experiments, of grant applications, and piecing together what was going on in the Wuhan Institute of Virology over recent years, what experiments they were doing, what they resulted in, and whether or not they could be related to this virus. But, there's a database at that institute. It has 22,000 entries in it, all different, related to different pathogens, different viruses and bacteria. We've not been allowed to see it. It went offline in September 2019. The purpose of that database was to help the world prepare for the next pandemic. It was part of something called the Global Virome Project. Well, which pandemic are they waiting for? Why not produce it and share with us what information you've got and how that could be helpful?
So what have you identified about COVID-19 that leads you to the conclusion that it could well have come from a laboratory?
Well, the virus has a number of features that are unusual about it. For example, it contains an insertion called a furin cleavage site. That's not been found in any other SARS-like virus before. That's something that's been inserted into other viruses before as part of experiments to make them easier to grow in laboratories. There was a proposal to do exactly that to a SARS-like virus in this laboratory. And when this virus sequence was identified, they failed to draw attention to this particular feature of it, which was a bit odd because it stands out like a sore thumb. As my co-author puts it, it's like a unicorn turning up and you describe the hooves and the mane, but not the horn. That's an example of the sorts of things. But also, when they first identified the virus and they sequenced its genome, they said, we've got another virus that's very similar. It was found in Yunnan previously. This is its name. Well, I tried to track down where it was found, who found it, etc. Blank. I couldn't find anything about it. Turned out its name was brand new. They'd invented it the week before. They'd been calling it something else for the previous 7 years. It was in their freezer in the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That's where they found it. But it was in the freezer because they'd gone to a mine shaft in Yunnan 7 years before, where 6 people had got sick and 3 of them had died. And this was thought to be the first case of people directly catching a bat virus and dying from it. They'd brought those back to the lab, and then they'd sequenced it in 2018, and then they'd been working on it since. And they said, no, we sequenced it yesterday. And then they said, that's the only virus we've got from there. Well, it turned out there were 8 others, and so on. So these are the kinds of details we're having to piece together: which sites they visited, which viruses they collected, what they did with them in the lab, which parts of the spike gene they swapped into other viruses, and so on. It's an extraordinary detective story, really, and we're not at the end of it yet.
But thankfully, we have you on the case. Now, Benedict, I'm just going to quickly throw to you. I mean, do you smell cover-up here? And do you think that's because there are a lot of fingerprints when it comes to the Wuhan laboratory? It's not just China.
I mean, that's the difficulty, isn't it? Though very often the Chinese government, it does operate in secrecy, and not just the government itself, sort of all sorts of bodies in China are associated, because that's just the culture that exists. I mean, there is also, a lot of people say, it's very unlikely, but it's not unprecedented that things do leak from laboratories, including very high security ones. I think smallpox has leaked, anthrax has accidentally been shipped from a lab before. These things happen more often than we like to admit. So actually, why would you rule that out, given that it does happen more often than anybody would want to be the case? And I do think that's just the thing, isn't it? It's the sort of the culture of omerta that exists in China and within parts of the scientific community. Makes you think, well, actually, why would they do that automatically? If it was all entirely, innocent. Now, I understand why. There's issues of national security in China that they have to sort of pay attention to. Every major country, they have programs when it comes to engineering viruses for safety purposes, for pandemic purposes, but also for military reasons. There's lots of reasons why. But nonetheless, I do agree that the fact that there just was, this complete sort of shutdown and all sorts of, different trails that one could have gone down, and so many sort of different competing theories, does lend itself to the idea that it's entirely possible. And the fact that the global community did come out and go, absolutely not, you can't push this, it's racist, it's conspiratorial, all of these bad things, you can't talk about it. That, I think, just sort of sets off alarm bells in people's minds. They've seen too many things that have been labelled conspiracy in the past to then be proven true, to think, oh, well, if the authorities say it's conspiracy theory, well, it must be then.
And Lord Ridley, very briefly, we haven't got long left on the programme. The publication of your book, do you think it's going to precipitate any broader international investigation, or do you think that's it? The international community are deaf to hearing about your findings?
No, we're hearing from a lot of scientists and from a lot of other people of relevance and expertise saying we need to follow up on this. We need to develop a way of protecting the world against the next pandemic, whether it comes from a terrorist organisation with a laboratory doing it deliberately, or whether it comes from an accidental release, or whether it comes through the market, frankly. We should be acting to tighten up the rules around research, but also the rules about the sale of wildlife in markets, because we don't at the moment know which of them did it, and so we ought to be doing both. So I do welcome Boris Johnson saying that both of those are on the table and Britain will be pushing them in a pandemic treaty. That's the way to go, to get talking to our allies about this.
Lord Ridley, Benedict Spence, thank you ever so much, and thank you to you for tuning in today. Same time, same place from tomorrow. This programme's not long enough, is it? But hang fire, because next you've got Darren McCaffrey with The Briefing. That's bye from me, though. Bye-bye.
Hello again. Bright and breezy sums up the afternoon for most of us. Sunny spells. There are a few showers around. It's breezy, but of course nothing like as windy as recent days. We've actually got a fairly active cold front slipping south. Active means it's got some pretty heavy rain on it. Earlier today brought a very wet start over parts of southern Scotland, northern England and Wales, but it is pushing southwards, and as it is drifting southwards, it's fizzling out. Still bringing some rain for a time across East Anglia and the southeast through the early afternoon, but it is scooting away fairly rapidly. Sunshine follows and a few showers for North Wales, northwest England, and particularly western Scotland, where they're falling snow over the hills. A scattering of showers coming in on a brisk breeze for Northern Ireland. It is breezy, but it's pretty mild across the south, 11, 12 degrees. Further north, closer to average in single figures. We'll keep the showers coming in across Scotland this evening. Still some snow over the hills. Mostly rain at lower levels. The showers elsewhere easing off, so much of England and Wales having a dry night and a clear night, and a bit of a cold one as well. Enough breeze to stop towns and cities dropping to freezing, but certainly rural areas, some pockets of frost possible. We start off with more wet weather then across Scotland, and this weather front is going to be slower to head southwards, so quite a wet day over the Highlands, the rain turning increasingly to snow, but also pushing into the central belt and Northern Ireland, so a soggy afternoon here. For England and Wales, most places dry, just a few showers drifting into South Wales, the Midlands and southwest England. Sunny spells across the east, but it's going to get windy, particularly to the east of the Pennines, northeast England up to eastern Scotland. Very gusty conditions through Wednesday afternoon, and increasingly the winds picking up and bringing more snow showers through Wednesday night across western Scotland and Northern Ireland. So we're quite concerned about this area here, that cold front pushing south, introducing the cold air everywhere, but some snow and strong winds likely in the northwest as we go into Thursday. That's all your weather from me for now. Goodbye.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content